King on WION at this hour, and this, of course, is coming from Australia, where there's been a bit of a dramatic escalation in the spat between the Australian government and Facebook. And now, believe it or not, Facebook has blocked all news media content in Australia on its social media platform. So Australians this morning, out of the blue, woke up to an empty news feed on their Facebook timelines after the social media giant blocked all news media content in the country, escalating its dispute with the Australian government over sharing of the revenue that it generates by showing news content on its platform. Now, the Australian government has, of course, been pretty quick to react. It has described the move as heavy-handed and completely wrong.
Facebook was wrong. Facebook's actions were unnecessary. They were heavy-handed and they will damage its reputation here in Australia. Their decision to block Australians' access to government sites, be they about support through the pandemic, mental health, emergency services, the Bureau of Meteorology, were completely unrelated to the media code, which is yet to pass through the Senate.
Meanwhile, the localised ban has affected several Australian emergency services as well. Pages that carry warnings about COVID outbreaks, bushfires and cyclones have also been rendered blank. Believe it or not, fire, health and even meteorological services around the country were also experiencing problems with their Facebook pages, which are regularly used to issue emergency warnings in the disaster-prone nation.
The fact that there are organisations like state health departments, fire and emergency services and so on who have had their Facebook pages blocked, that's a public safety issue. I've spoken to Facebook this morning and said the government expects them to restore those pages as quickly as possible. There is great responsibility that comes with being a platform that, as the Digital Platforms Inquiry said, has over 17 million Australians visited every month.
Now, this move has come in the wake of the looming laws that are presently under deliberation, which have passed the lower legislature in the Australian Parliament and are to be taken up in the upper chamber of the Australian Parliament. And this law intends to make social media giants such as Facebook and Google pay publishers for the content that they use. Unlike Facebook, however, Google has already sealed deals with several publishing outlets in recent days. The Australian law would require Facebook and Google to reach commercial deals with news outlets whose links drive traffic to their platforms or be subjected to forced arbitration to agree to a price. Now, Australia's competition watchdog has maintained that for every $100 that is generated in terms of online advertising, Google corners about $53, while Facebook takes $28. And it is the rest that is left that is what goes to the media outlets. Now, the law has been designed to address the loss of advertising revenue from traditional media companies to the digital behemoths. Google made $4.3 billion in advertising revenue in Australia last year, and Facebook made about $0.7 billion, according to documents that have been filed with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. The situation is said to be similar in the rest of the world, and Facebook's move comes as tech platforms are facing increasing pressure to share revenue with news media portals that are the original creators of content. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what's actually playing out in this spat between Facebook and the Australian government, we're joined in by John Blaxland, who is a professor at the Australian National University and was also a former Australian Army officer. Mr. Blaxland, thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us on this broadcast on WION. And let me begin by asking you this. What is playing out between Facebook and the Australian government, and what has prompted Facebook to resort to this kind of a drastic step?
Yes, thanks, Mohammed. Thanks for having me on this program. It's a drastic move taken by Facebook. It's really outrageous what they've done in the face of quite reasonable legislation that has sought to balance out the scales, if you like. Australian media enterprises, print, radio and television have all experienced considerable financial hits from the dominance of the social media websites, particularly Google and Facebook. And Google, interestingly enough, facing competition from Bing, came to an agreement with the Australian government to recognise that profit sharing was a reasonable thing to do, and agreed to hundreds of millions of dollars to compensate media that use Google. In the case of Facebook, however, they're virtually a monopoly in this space. They don't have a Bing-like competitor. And Mark Zuckerberg, it appears, has decided to be high-handed and flex his corporate muscles, if you like, in a way that I think it displays a remarkable callous and arrogant approach to the incredible trust that people have placed in his platform. And I think it's a very important point in our history. And as we reflect, I think around the world, people will be looking on aghast at the draconian measure that Mark Zuckerberg and his team at Facebook have taken over Facebook. It really is extraordinary that this measure has been taken.
Right.
That what the Australian government was requesting was not unreasonable. It was about just compensation, but it had a precedent that was going to set for the globe. And Mark Zuckerberg, you got to ask yourself, how much profit is enough, Mark? And clearly, this man has got a problem with avarice.
Absolutely, indeed. Now, something that has actually taken aback a lot of people and something that has shocked a lot of people is that it's not just the news content by these news media portals that has been taken off by Facebook onto its platform and its news feed for people who access Facebook in Australia, but also something, as simple as government services, such as police information, health updates from the health department, and even updates from the meteorological department. What is the Australian government saying about this, and how do they intend to actually somehow ensure that this information is made available for the public?
Well, this battle isn't over yet, Mohammed. We're going to see a considerable pushback now. There'll be a deplatforming, if you like, from the Facebook space and looking to alternatives, including Google and other social media platforms, to get the message out for important platforms. So we're going to see websites, I think, from some of the media organisations being approached more directly. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the news service, the National News Service, radio and television, the print media and the various television media, who all run their own websites as well. We're going to see them probably benefit to a certain extent, because there's remarkable unanimity politically in Australia in reaction to what's happened. There's a real sense, and it's happened, you've seen a number of senior political figures in Australia on both sides of the political aisle coming out quite strongly critical, and some of the media that I follow from the left and the right of the political spectrum condemning what's happened, speaking very critically of Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook's action. So I don't know that Zuckerberg and Facebook have quite appreciated just how strong the pushback would be. My sense is that this is going to be a catalyst for significant action, and Mark Zuckerberg may not have quite appreciated what he was facing.
All right, Professor Blackstone, thank you very much indeed for joining us on WION and getting us all those updates into this very interesting story that I'm sure is being followed around the world by all news portals and indeed by everyone around the world, because this is something drastic where Facebook, because it disagreed with the law that was being proposed by the Australian government, has blanked out the news feeds for people across Australia.